Ситуации хуже не бывает. Один неверный шаг, и начнется настоящий.
Welcome to Watch Mojo. Today we're looking at perilous gambles in history which almost completely backfired. For this list, everything doesn't necessarily mean the whole world, but everything from the risk-taker's perspective.
A smaller but much better army takes on a very big, very strong opponent, and on an open plain, there's no ambush, there's no surprise.
Black Saturday.
Looked like we were going to cut a deal to get us all out of this mess.
Today, the Soviets are reneging. We're going to try and salvage the situation, but a lot of things are going wrong today.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was perhaps the closest humans have come to mutually assured destruction. In 1962, the Cold War between America and the Soviets peaked. America placed nukes in Turkey and Italy, motivating the Soviets to put their own in Cuba. This turned into a Caribbean standoff.
Khrushchev knew that he was losing control of events in Cuba. He was also told that Kennedy was under severe pressure from the military to act. If another U.S. plane were shot down, it might trigger a clash neither wanted.
On Black Saturday, the U.S. Navy accidentally dropped practice depth charges on a Soviet nuclear submarine without telling them. The submarine nearly retaliated by launching their nukes, but thankfully one commander refused to give his consent. The whole crisis was an enormous risk that almost wiped out humanity.
It was widely hailed as a war game, but this was a slight exaggeration. The maneuvers were designed simply to give the men experience in landing their heavy equipment, keeping it running in the sand and salt water.
Nuclear bombs in Korea.
The Marines can consolidate to begin a fighting withdrawal out of the Chosin Trap. Hagaru's unfinished airfield, now the only means of getting out the growing number of wounded, must be completed and made operational.
In 1950, the Korean War began, a proxy war between both sides of the Cold War. The North was communist, the South capitalist. Douglas MacArthur was one of the most famous American generals in history, and he was a major player in the war. It wasn't as easy to win as they expected, and in 1951, MacArthur was nearly authorized to use nuclear weapons on China. Thankfully, the Atomic Energy Commission didn't like this idea and refused to give MacArthur this power. Truman preferred a less aggressive approach and eventually relieved him from command to avoid nuclear war with China.
Let no heart be faint. Let every arm be steeled. The divine guidance of God points the way. Follow in his name to the holy grail of righteous victory.
Heraclius's reign. Heraclius came to power after an extremely risky revolt against Phocas in 1610, a widely hated ruler. If failed, he would have been executed without a second thought, but he managed it. The Roman Empire was on life support at this point. By 627, the Sasanian Empire had captured Egypt, Syria, and most of Anatolia.
He speaks of a new prophet in Arabia.
Was it like this when John the Baptist came to King Herod, out of the desert, crying about salvation?
Instead of surrendering, Heraclius bet everything on a counter-offensive. He restructured the economy and personally led his army deep into Persia. If he had failed, the Roman Empire would have been annihilated from history. The Battle of Nineveh in 627 brought him to a decisive victory against the Sasanians. Without his actions, they might have fallen to the Sasanians or been unable to completely resist the Arab conquests in the 630s. The Tet Offensive.
If we've got to die on this tower, let us die like men and Marines and don't embarrass ourselves or our families or the Marine Corps.
Now for a textbook example of a massive miscalculation. In 1968, during the brutal Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese launched a surprise attack on the South. It was a military defeat for the North, with most attacks being repelled. Still, its consequences were devastating. It revealed to the U.S. public just how unwinnable the war was. In 1967, General Westmoreland famously declared they could see the light at the end of the tunnel.
You know, Vietnam reminded me of a child, the developing of a child. The laws of nature control the development of this child. The child has to sit up before it crawls. It has to crawl before it walks. It has to walk before it runs.
This coordinated offensive from the communists showed just how false this claim was. Support for the war plummeted, President Johnson was humiliated, and the U.S. would eventually leave in the early 70s.
The enemy has very deceitfully taken advantage of the Tet ceasefire to launch an offensive all over the country. So far, we've had it pretty easy here.
Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Now for a move so risky it became an idiom. The Rubicon River was the boundary between Gaul and Italy, and Caesar's crossing was considered treason, since a general was forbidden from bringing legions into Roman territory without the Senate's approval. This was an act of civil war, and if defeated, he would have been executed, and his entire faction destroyed. The Roman Republic was in a fragile state, and Caesar was heavily outnumbered. A defeat would have caused further unrest, but he emerged victorious, marking the end of the Republic. He would eventually be killed by the Senate, but his heir Augustus finished what he started, and Rome entered a golden age.
I can abide the law and surrender my arms to the Senate and watch the Republic fall to tyranny and chaos. Or I can go home with my sword in my hand and run those maniacs to the Tarpeian Rock! Yeah!
The Penkovsky False Warning.
Oleg Penkovsky is a curious figure. He was profoundly arrogant. He may have had delusions of grandeur about both his own importance and where he could serve the Americans and the British.
Colonel Oleg Penkovsky was a Cold War double agent. A lot of people credit him for defusing the Cuban Missile Crisis by providing the U.S. with Soviet information. In 1962, he also sent a warning to Western intelligence agencies that the Soviet Union was about to launch a nuclear strike.
They will not catch us. The KGB will have no idea. Listen, I'm better at this than they are.
Fine, but I'm not.
He made these calls after the crisis ended. One was received by the CIA, the other by MI6. Both recipients believed the information wasn't genuine and decided to do nothing. This was an immense risk, since if it had been true, Europe and the US would have been annihilated. Thankfully, their instincts were correct, and nuclear war was averted.
In just 18 months, he rattled powerful USSR and radically changed the balance of power between the East and the West.
The Battle of Cannae.
At the front, the Roman attack became bogged down because of its densely packed formation. At the back, the Carthaginian cavalry closed in.
Hannibal Barca was one of Rome's greatest enemies. He was a Carthaginian general whose father made him swear to destroy Rome. In 218 BC, he began the Second Punic War, crossing the Alps on elephants. This extreme risk nearly cost him his army, but once he made it into Italy, he quickly allied with the local Gallic tribes who hated Rome.
Hannibal must have known that this was it. This was Rome's big attempt to exterminate him, and they thought they could do it, as they always had done, by sheer weight of numbers.
This helped him achieve multiple crushing defeats against the Romans. Most notable was at Cannae, when the Senate sent around 86,000 soldiers to fight Hannibal.
In front of the massed Roman infantry, Hannibal places his allies from Spain and Gaul. They will bear the brunt of Rome's attack.
He executed a double envelopment tactic, and this cunning maneuver resulted in 50 to 70,000 being slaughtered in a day. Rome's decision to fight Hannibal nearly cost them their republic, motivating their later decision to avoid fighting Hannibal at all costs.
I'd be surprised if he thought that after Cannae that was it, that the war was over. So naturally he would have paused for a moment to say, wow.
1983 Soviet false alarm.
I started giving commands, everyone in place, monitor all functions, do this and that, according to instructions. Everything pointed to a yes except for one thing. The launch was not confirmed visually.
Returning to the Cold War, in 1983, humanity had another near miss with mutually assured destruction. In September, the Soviet warning system alerted them about 5 American ICBMs. Engineer Stanislav Petrov found it suspicious, essentially since only 5 nukes were launched, nowhere near enough to destroy the USSR. Rather than relay the warning, he decided to wait for confirmation.
103-101, космическая система выдала сигнал. Пошла ракета, повторяю, пошла баллистическая ракета. Военная база, западное побережье США.
None came, because it was a malfunction. The missiles were just sunlight. If Petrov had relayed the message, then a counterattack would have developed into a full-scale nuclear war. Unfortunately, Petrov wasn't rewarded for his bravery, since officials were embarrassed about the false positive.
The incident embarrassed the military command of the Soviet army. Petrov was made into a scapegoat. He was eventually forced into early retirement.
The Battle of Manzikert. The Eastern Roman Empire experienced a golden age during the medieval period, but its decline began in 1025 after the death of Basil II. This battle between the Romans and the Seljuks resulted in an overwhelming defeat, with many Roman forces, including Turkic mercenaries, in their ranks. Many refused to fight or even defected, and the Seljuk Empire gained almost complete control over Anatolia. This almost destroyed their empire, but in 1081, Alexios Komnenos took the throne. He spent his reign dealing with crisis after crisis, and after almost 40 years on the throne, the Roman Empire was stable once again. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into Settings and switch on your notifications. Operation Overlord.
Store party! No armor has made it ashore. We got no DD tanks on the beach. Dog 1 is not open!
The Normandy landings were the largest seaborne in military history. France was firmly under German control until June 1944, when nearly 160,000 Allied troops crossed the Channel. By summer's close, more than 2 million Allied soldiers were in France. Its success was vital to toppling Hitler's regime, but was far from guaranteed. A failure would have prolonged the war, giving the Nazis a stronger hold on Europe.
We all have orders and we have to follow them. That supersedes everything, including your mothers.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Even if you think the mission's FUBAR, sir?
Especially if you think the mission's FUBAR.
The Nazis would have strengthened their defenses, and a second invasion may have never succeeded. Thankfully, the risk paid off, and within weeks, Paris and later France were liberated.
They locked me in a broken-down potting shed and told me to imagine I was a prisoner trying to escape. If I used that wall, I'd be shot. If I climbed that fence, I'd be electrocuted. If I trod here, there, anywhere, I'd be blown up by hidden mines.
What do you think was the most precarious gamble in history? Leave it in the comments below. Check out these other clips from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.